Hi, Carlo.
Hi, how's it going?
Hi, I'm good. I'm so sorry for that. Yeah, a little bit late. I did some interview with the participant,
Yeah, no worries at all. Good.
but still using the same too. Because of our project. It's nice, yeah. Okay. So, Pamisdi, what about our D?
Yes.
He wants to say something or in the middle of our program?
I think what is it? Just go first
Okay, okay, yeah.
uh, directly, and then when he joined, then we can invite him to make some small speech.
Oke, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Ya, oke. Before that, oke. Kalau let me to share something because the participant, there is the previous participant and also there is the new comers, yeah, the newcomers. So I want you to let them know this is you can access what the Carlo did in his website. Yeah, it's about uh, Carlo. He is a doctoral student candidate, and uh, yeah, last week I remember that there is a celebration of job. What is your current? Do you have any good news or something like that?
So I'm finishing up my PhD here at Michigan State University,
Okay.
where I'm wearing the sweater right there in second language studies. And in August, I will begin a new position as an assistant professor of second language education at Florida State University, uh,
Wow.
different university here in the United States.
Congratulations,
Congratulations.
Carlo.
Thank
We
you.
Yeah,
are very happy to hear
yeah.
that.
Florida State University or Florida University?
Florida State University,
Oh,
Florida.
Florida State University. Oh, okay. Pak Misdi,
Uh,
you can.
Nova Publishing. Is it Mas Jerry? Nova Publishing, yeah, from Florida, right?
Mostafa Papi, Phil Hiver,
TKR.
Xiaofeng Li was recently there, and now he is somewhere else.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so yeah, he will graduated in short term and maybe a couple of months from now, and he has already position in assistant professor in Florida State University. And in terms of research, he has a lot to do. It is the book collection. I like it. I like this picture. Yeah, and it is his work in many academic journal and article, and you can access the video and YouTube. And for teaching, maybe Carlo, do you mind if you can put your sharing session in your website so so our university will be in your website.
Yeah, definitely. I'd be happy to do that. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, and there is the conference participant. Yeah, a lot of international conference he attended a long time ago and a couple of years starting from PhD program. Okay, there's a little bit about Carlo, and time is yours.
I
Yeah,
am
you
having,
can.
I'm having a little bit of a here issue with the, there we go. Okay. Um, Making sure the slides are working. Okay. Um, okay. Well, thank you everybody for the invitation to be here and chat with you all. If you were here a few weeks ago when I visited, I came and I talked about a couple different topics, but I shared a project that I worked on that was about academic socialization of graduate students and the methodological and theoretical ideas related to things like, well, the theoretical ideas related to things like identity and emotion and well-being and academic socialization of graduate students. But I think the things that I talked about are relevant to people who are not just graduate students, but people who work in academic spaces, language educational spaces, et cetera. And so the methodological things that I talked about were narrative inquiry and autoethnography. And so in that project that I talked about, I combined narrative inquiry and autoethnography to study my own experience as a new graduate student navigating the academic systems that I was working in. With the project that I'll talk about today, it's similar because it also combines narrative inquiry and autoethnography. That's I guess, a theme in a lot of my work is that it usually uses one of those two tools. The topic is a little bit different, though, and I think the topic will be maybe relevant to a lot of people, but it has to do with emotions, things that we feel in our work, especially in our work as language educators. And so yeah, Henry, can you remind me how much time you want to have for sort of presentation and how much time you want to have for discussion?
Yeah, for presentation, it could be an hour, and after that we have a question and discussion session. So in total, an hour and a half.
Okay. I'll try not to talk for an hour because I think it might be more interesting to have a conversation with everybody. But yeah, okay, sounds good. Okay, great. Well, then what I'll do is I'll share my screen um and go from there. So if I do, oh, okay, I just clicked share screen. It says sharing is not turned on. I
Yeah,
sent maybe you
okay,
can.
yeah, okay, you can.
Okay,
Okay, go ahead.
perfect. Okay, can you see this, my slides?
Yes, we can see that.
Okay, and it's just slides. It's not presenter view.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay. I don't have any notes. I just want to make sure you can see the full slide. That's all. Okay, good. Okay, so thank you everybody again for the invitation to be here. My name is Carlos Sinaglia. I am at Michigan State University, and the title of this project is
Hello,
Emotion.
I'm so sorry for that. Do you mind if I record this meeting because some of the university couldn't come, so they can see that.
Yes,
Okay, I'm so sorry for that. Yeah,
This
that's
meeting
okay.
is
Yeah,
being
good idea.
recorded.
Good idea.
yeah,
Let me know when you started.
yeah. Already started.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. My name is Carlos Sinaglia. I'm at Michigan State University, and the project that I'm talking about was a collaborative effort with two of my colleagues. So I put their names on the screen as well, Philip Montgomery and Matthew Koss. Matthew Koss is also a doctoral candidate in second language studies at Michigan State University, and Philip Montgomery was, and now he is an assistant professor of multilingual education at Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan. And so we are collaborators and we work together on this project. And we called this project Emotionally Inhospitable Spaces, with parentheses around in, right? In hospital or hospitable spaces. So thinking about this idea of emotions, hospitality, maybe how we feel welcome, how we feel like we belong. This is a collaborative autoethnography, right? So the project that I talked about a few weeks ago was just an autoethnography where I'm sort of studying my own experience. This is a collaborative autoethnography where we studied our own experiences together and talked about them. And the topic is about language teacher emotions or language teacher educator emotions, and specifically this idea of emotion labor. And so, yeah, I'll talk a little bit about that. So my plan was to be able to talk about, again, four different things. This is sort of how I organized the previous presentation. A little bit of like background. So what about language teacher emotions are we focusing on? That's sort of the literature review part of the presentation. The methodology, I've highlighted some parts of collaborative autoethnography and narrative analysis. So sort of the way that we went about doing this project. I've got lots of examples of our findings and the sort of results that we found, and then a little bit of discussion at the end about what are the implications, how might these ideas, these insights connect to our roles as language educators, language teacher educators, and people who work with other people in language educational spaces. And so I hope that when I finish this, when we have our discussion, we can talk about any of these things, right? I'll probably talk a little bit more about maybe one of these topics than the other one, but we can talk about any of these things that you want to talk about during the discussion. And so this is sort of the plan for what I'm going to talk about next. So Yeah, we'll start with the background. So, language. Oh, I'm sorry. And these are most importantly, these are us, our team. This is us. These are our collaborators. So I am on the left. I'm Carlo here. What you see is that beneath the three pictures is sort of the individual details about our specific teaching backgrounds, the different contexts that we've worked in, and then sort of what's in common. And so for me, Carlo, I have a background teaching English and Spanish, but for this project, I was reflecting on my experiences teaching Spanish in a university context, teaching applied linguistics and language teacher education courses, and working with pre-service language teachers in a mentoring context. Philip has experience as a middle school and high school Spanish instructor, so a language teacher at sort of a younger level, but then also teaching English and applied linguistics courses in a post-secondary higher education context. And then he worked as a teacher educator, as a mentor in a writing center on our campus, right? So the writing center, working with other consultants in the writing center, he was sort of mentoring them. And then Matt has taught Spanish and Chinese at all levels, from young children to older learners, and also has mentored and taught pre-service and in-service language teachers in a variety of ways. So we all have like experience as language teachers and as language teacher educators, but in slightly different contexts. But we're also, at the time of the study, we were all PhD candidates and teacher researchers. So we have sort of one foot in the teaching practice, teacher education space, and another foot in the researcher space. And sort of being teacher researchers at the same time led us to want to sort of do this project. We're interested in supporting language teachers. We're interested in emotions. We're interested in how we can understand emotions and use what we know about emotions to maybe support teachers in our work. So that's sort of the genesis of this project, right? So, so emotions are not a new thing in second language acquisition research. We know that. And so I guess to introduce this, I wanted to start by talking about this blue book on the left, but maybe more importantly, the scholar in the green jacket on the right. So the blue book on the left is called The Affective Dimension in Second Language Acquisition. It was published in 2013. It was an edited volume by Danuta Gabris-Barker and Joanna Bielska. But interestingly, one of the chapters that I'm highlighting was written by Aneta Pavlenko, who is pictured on the right. And I met her in Philadelphia when I was a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania. She was a graduate student, or she was a professor at Temple University. And I met her at a conference at Temple University. I was giving a presentation about something, and she came up to me afterwards and said, could you send me your slides? I would like to use them in my class and use them as an example for my student. And she's famous. And I was like, oh my goodness, wow, you're interested in my work. This is so exciting. This makes me feel, proud and confident and like I belong here. And it was like a positive emotional experience for me that she recognized my work. And so I always have that memory of my first interaction with her of like positive emotions, which is fitting because she writes a lot about the role of emotions in language education, language learning. And so she wrote a chapter in this book, and that chapter is called The Affective Turn in SLA. And she's kind of tracing about the sort of trajectory of how the emotional focus in SLA has evolved over the years. So she says, from affective factors to language desire, and then commodification of affect. And I guess what she's saying is affective factors may be psychological variables that predict language learning outcomes. Language desire, maybe for how people subjectively experience emotion, right? And then commodification of affect, how institutions might capitalize on individual emotion and affect us in different ways, right? She's kind of tracing how the idea of emotion has evolved in second language acquisition research. And so in this chapter, in this book, she outlines this, right? So she talks about how you can think of these bullet points as sort of progressing earlier to later. So earlier research in second language acquisition was focused on things like anxiety, other negative emotions that students experience. And now in more recent years, you have a bigger focus on positive emotions, positive psychology, looking at things like enjoyment and pride and linguistic security and comfort, right? Earlier research in second language acquisition was maybe focused about like cognitive processes and psychology. More recent approaches in second language acquisition have incorporated a sociological focus or a more social perspective on how we experience things. And we also see a transition in not just focusing on the student, but also focusing on the teacher, and now also focusing on the teacher educator, I would say. And so each of these trends, each of these sort of developments, I think is reflected in the focus of the paper that we've been working on. But it's a really helpful chapter, and I encourage everybody who's interested, if you're new to the idea of emotions in SLA, this is a really great chapter to start out looking with. So in other words, the questions that we ask about emotions in our research, earlier questions were maybe like, what are emotions, right? Maybe later questions were, how do these emotions affect language learning and now language teaching? And I think if we start to think a little bit more like structurally and micro, meso, macro, ecologically, we can think about where do emotions come from and what do these emotions tell us about the social contexts of language education that we experience. And so that's kind of the focus of this project, is we're looking at things like what emotions do we experience, but we're trying to understand the contexts that we work in. And that's kind of, again, the idea of autoethnography, is we're studying our own experience to understand the contexts that we're in. And so we're looking at emotions. We're also looking at these different theoretical lenses we're using, things like identity and agency and emotion. And identity we can talk about as somebody's sense of self in relation to other people, in relation to the world, who people understand themselves to be, right? Agency we can think of as like how in control of our decisions and experiences. And then emotion, what we feel, right? And how that affects us, right? So if we think as language teachers, as educators, we have to make decisions, right? And a lot of times our decisions are shaped by a lot of different things. Sometimes our decisions are shaped by our individual values as educators. Sometimes our decisions are shaped by the expectations that other people have, like our colleagues or our students or our supervisors. And sometimes the things that we do are shaped by like rules or policies or obligations that we have based on the curricular or policy context that we work in. And so we make decisions based on all of these things. And if there's alignment, if what we want to do is the same thing as what our students want us to do, is the same thing as what our colleagues want us to do, is the same thing as what we are required to do by the curriculum, by the policy where we work, if all of those things are in alignment, theoretically, our identity is supported, our agency is supported, we experience well-being, right? We are in control of what we can do. We feel good. We feel a sense of meaning and purpose, and we feel like we are legitimate as a teacher, right? And so Peter DaCosta, Bonnie Norton, Sarah Mercer, and a bunch of other colleagues have written about how this idea of alignment between these different expectations and values and decisions, alignment supports a teacher's sense of identity and agency and well-being, right? But the reality is that most times teachers don't experience alignment between all of these things. There's always some kind of tension, right? What we want and what our students expect of us might not be the same, or what we want and what our supervisor or our institution expects of us might not be the same. And so when there's misalignment, that's where it's interesting, because this misalignment we think can constrain and really challenge teachers' identity, their sense of self, their agency, their sense of being able to control their actions and control their environment, and their well-being, their sense of purpose, their sense of meaning, right? And so if there's misalignment, it leads to this kind of tension. And so Philip Montgomery, one of my collaborators on this project, he and I have written a lot about this idea of misalignment and how it can affect identity and agency and well-being, right? And so whether there's alignment or misalignment, either way, we're going to feel something. There's some emotion that we're going to feel, right? So I think it's all relevant. And so if we think about this idea of emotions and how this idea of tension might happen when our decisions don't always align with these different sort of reasons why we make decisions, we think about where this misalignment comes from, and we think about how it affects us. And so this is a simplification, I know that, but we visualized with this triangle sort of teachers making decisions based on their practices, their values, and their institutional obligations, that these three things might not always be in alignment. If they are always in alignment, that's great, and you probably have a great job and time as a teacher. For me, in my experience as a teacher, they were usually not always in alignment, right? And not always, but sometimes when there's a misalignment, we can feel things like emotions, like let's say negative emotions, right? Let's say if we want to do something, but our institution does not allow us to, like my institution says I have to teach this way, but I think it's important to teach that way. We might feel frustrated as teachers, or when our institution wants us to teach a certain way and we decide to do that, but it's not in line with our teaching philosophy or our values, we might feel a sense of guilt. There's a whole range of emotions we can feel as teachers when there's this misalignment, right? So I'm representing that with this red circle on the right-hand side that just says emotions, right? And what I'm going to talk about is this concept of emotion labor. Emotion labor. And so the idea of emotion labor, I'm going to pause and just show you this picture here. This idea of emotion labor was put forth by a scholar at, I think, Stanford University, a sociologist named Arlie Hochschild, called The Managed Heart. The Managed Heart, the commercialization of human feeling. And Arlie Hochschild was studying flight attendants, right? Flight attendants on airplanes, and was kind of thinking about how the flight attendants on airplanes were kind of expected to be happy all the time, smile when they were providing service to the people on the airplane. And if you think about it, when you're on an airplane, your flight attendants that you interact with, usually they seem pretty happy, or maybe, I don't know, maybe they don't. But her research was looking at how flight attendants on airplanes felt the need to sort of perform being happy to customers, right? Service with a smile, right? To always kind of be comforting and caring and positive to their clients, even if that's not how they were feeling, especially when they probably weren't feeling that, because being a flight attendant on an airplane is a very stressful job. But she was looking at how when people have to sort of perform their emotions, they are pretending or hiding their emotions. That's this emotional sort of management. And when this is commodified or commercialized, when it's part of their job that they get paid for, she calls this emotion labor. Emotion labor. And so the idea of thinking how the way we experience emotions, the way we show emotions, the way we hide emotions, as that being like a part of our job that we're evaluated on. So she developed this idea of emotion labor. And very recently, just a few years ago in the journal System, these two scholars, Sarah Benesch and Matt Pryor, published an article, and they're talking about this concept of emotion labor and talking about how it applies to language education research, especially language education research that has as its goal to support teachers and students to create spaces where their emotions are supported, right? It's not that teachers should never feel bad and always feel good. It's that teachers will feel bad, but we should allow teachers to feel bad, and we should help teachers to not have to hide their emotions, but to feel all of their emotions, because teaching is a complex emotional experience. And so it's a really, really great article where they talk about how we can make sure that how we're thinking about emotion labor as language education researchers supports teachers. And so I'm going to go back to the slide that I was showing here. So we know that this misalignment can result in emotions, right? But what happens when teachers are not able to show those emotions, right? So earlier, I showed you this slide where there's a sort of red circle on the right-hand side of the triangle. When there's tension from misalignment, that might result in, let's say, some negative emotions. But maybe the teachers are in a context where there are expectations for what kinds of emotions they're allowed to feel or not feel. So teachers might feel the need to show certain emotions or hide certain emotions. I have to always show that I'm happy. I have to hide that I'm frustrated, even though my students are frustrating me, right? So emotion labor is all about how teachers might have this expectation placed upon them to display and show certain emotions or hide and conceal certain emotions, right? So that's called emotion labor. So I'm showing that, I'm representing that in this figure with the blue space that I'm calling an emotionally inhospitable space. It's not hospitable. Emotions cannot live there, right? Real emotions cannot live there. Instead, you have fake emotions, emotion labor, right? Emotions that need to be hid or shown, right? So feeling rules are like these expectations. So you have to hide your bad emotions and show only your good emotions, right? So feeling rules, Arlie Hochschild says, these are institutional expectations for how emotions should be controlled, hidden, displayed, or performed. And Benesch and Pryor, they talk about educational institutions as emotionally inhospitable spaces. And they said sometimes, or many times, when institutional contexts don't allow for emotions to be authentically expressed, institutions are emotionally inhospitable spaces, right? Classrooms, just working at some kind of university or school or institution, any kind of space where teachers feel the need to change their emotions. They're saying that is an emotionally inhospitable space because it does not allow teachers to authentically experience their emotions. And so when we think about this idea of how teachers experience emotional labor, right? It's the same figure here, but in a different study. I don't have the illustration for it here, but Elizabeth Miller and Christina Konu did a project working with teachers in, I think, Greece and the United Kingdom. I can't remember, but it was a project where they were looking at teachers' experiences with emotion labor. And they were looking at how when teachers collaborated and reflected together about their emotion labor experiences, they developed what's called emotional capital, right? The ability to withstand or overcome this tension, this emotion labor. So using their emotions as resources, right? So this idea of emotional capital. And in their study, Konu and Miller talked about the importance of looking at emotional capital across different contexts and across different levels of experience. And that's kind of how we used their call, and we are responding to it by looking at our similar but different experiences across different contexts and with different levels of language education. And so Konu and Miller said we need to know more about how emotional capital develops in different contexts. So we thought, okay, let's use these guiding questions to look at our own experiences. And so the guiding questions for our study were, how does emotion labor reflect answerability to these different multiple commitments, also in the face of feeling rules? So when we feel like tension to different obligations, how does that make us feel? But then also when there are feeling rules, how do we have to experience emotion labor in that space? So what did we experience there? And then the second question was, by collaboratively reflecting together as three teacher educators, how does that process for us generate emotional capital for us? And so that was kind of what we were doing with our study. So to tell you a little bit about the methodology, again, like I talked about last time, we were combining autoethnography with narrative inquiry, right? So autoethnography, auto, ethno, and graphy, right? Graphy is we're studying, auto, our own experiences, and ethno, we're trying to understand the contexts and the systems and the institutions that we work within. So that's autoethnography. We're doing it together, right? And then we're looking at it through the lens of narrative. So narrative inquiry is what I talked about last time, right? So we're looking at how sense making is a way to tell stories, is a way to generate data, but it's also a way to analyze data, but it's also a way to report and write up data, right? And so autoethnography and narrative inquiry. I wanted to show again this slide from last time with the article from TESOL Journal that Hamid Mir Hosseini wrote. It's a really helpful introduction to autoethnography in language education research. So again, autoethnography, we're studying our own experiences to understand the systems and institutions and contexts that we work within. It's really helpful for people who work as teacher researchers like us, who are interested in sort of not just being a teacher or a researcher, but really blending that boundary. The goal is not necessarily to generalize to every other context. Instead, the goal is to just understand our own context first and foremost. So again, this is an article in TESOL Journal by Mir Hosseini, 2018, I think. Really helpful introduction if you're new to autoethnography. And then again, narrative inquiry, I wanted to highlight again, Gary Barkhuizen, Phil Benson, and Alice Chick wrote this book. The first edition was 2014. The second edition just came out last year, Narrative Inquiry and Language Teaching and Learning Research, right? So narrative inquiry is all about stories. Stories can be the data itself. Story can also be the way we analyze the data, and story can be the way that we present the data. So there's lots of methodological options within narrative inquiry. The focus is on how people use stories to make sense of experience. So the participant makes sense of their experience. The researcher and the participant make sense of the participant's experience, and then the researcher makes sense of the experience in writing something, right? In autoethnography, it's kind of we are the researcher and the participant. We're studying our own experiences. So we're using storytelling as a way to sort of make sense of our experiences together. And so what did that look like for us? Well, here is our methodological process as collaborative autoethnographers. And so there's 8 steps, right? And so what we did was we combined asynchronous and synchronous in-person and online, oral and written interactions. And so the first thing we did was we had a meeting together in person to talk about these topics and to come up with a reflection protocol. So a list of questions we were going to use to guide our reflections. And those questions were like, tell us about a time when your well-being was supported, or tell us about a time you had to hide your emotions, or tell us about a time as a teacher educator, you were working with a teacher and they were experiencing a challenging situation. How did you support them? Things like that. And so we came up with this reflection protocol. The next thing we did was we completed an individual narrative reflection. And so each of us had 3 separate Google documents. And so each of us in our own Google documents, we went through each question and we provided an abstract, sort of a 250 word snapshot saying, oh, I have a story about this. And very briefly, here's a preview about the story. So we did that for each of the questions. And then in step 3, we looked at each other's Google Docs and we made comments and responded to each of the snapshots and said, oh, this sounds like a really interesting story. Tell me more about this part, or I want to know more about this, or what about this, asking questions. After that, we read each other's comments, and in step 4, we went back to our own Google Docs and we elaborated on our reflections and we wrote larger narrative episodes. So for the first was a snapshot. This part in step 4 was to write an episode, so to really like extend it and kind of write out the scene of what happened. And here, what we were trying to do is with 750 to 1,000 words is to tell a little bit more of the story. After that, in step 5, we did a similar thing where we visited each other's Google Docs again, and we provided longer in-depth responses to each other's reflections with lots of questions, comments, and reactions. And this produced a pretty big corpus of like 3 different documents, a bunch of pages. We had about 17,000 plus words. It was pretty big, right? So after that, we used that as sort of the main textual data source. And so we used thematic analysis to go through each of the documents and see what are the different topics that are happening, what are we talking about, what are the similarities and differences, what themes are emergent. And so pretty typical thematic analysis for qualitative themes. We met again after that to talk about our notes and our analysis. So this was step 7. We were in person having a conversation, talking about these ideas that emerged, talking about the themes. And in that conversation, we kind of put a structure together for this paper. And then after we like left and went back to our own desks, and that's where we figured out which of the narratives, which were the stories we were going to include in our paper. And we were condensing these narrative reflections into what we call shorter vignettes, right? So vignettes, shorter stories, and then reconfiguring this to produce this overall autoethnographic narrative. And so you can think of it as a process of compressing and expanding and compressing and expanding stories, right? We're giving a snapshot, we're expanding it, we're compressing it, we're moving it around. So we're sharing these different stories with each other, but then we're writing a story about these different stories to see how they fit together. And so it's very, very, very qualitative. It's very interpretive. And some of my colleagues really like that, and some of my colleagues don't really like that. And so, narrative inquiry and autoethnography, I don't want to say they're not for everybody. I do think they're for everybody, but I think some people definitely like it and other people don't. It's definitely very sort of open. You have to be very open about it, right? So this was our process here. And we write about this in the paper that we wrote. And so just to give you an example of what that looked like, on this screen here, you have an example at the top of one of the prompts, right? Describe a time when your well-being as a language teacher was challenged, right? And then in the different colored text, you have blue and then purple, blue and then purple and then green. Those were the 3 of us. We each had our own different color, right? So just to summarize, in blue, I think I may have been blue. Yeah, when I taught Spanish, I felt restricted by the curriculum, the textbook. It needed to be implemented a certain way, a heavy focus on grammar and vocabulary. I tried new reflection activities about language ideologies. My colleagues were not very supportive of this, and I felt constrained. So I'm talking about how I felt, how my emotions were affected by my colleagues around me. And then in purple, Matt said, "Oh yeah, me too. Same, dude, same. Me too. I'm interested to hear more about what you tried, how you shared, how they reacted." And then Philip in green is kind of saying, okay, if we're going to talk about this, we need to unpack a little bit more. Tell us how this feeling constraint, what did that look like? What did you do? How did you feel? And so we're responding to each other's initial snapshots, asking for more information that's going to help us answer our research questions, right? Tell me more about this part, right? Another example here is when one of us is talking about, Philip is talking about pushing back on an administration about teaching hours, counting teaching hours, taking a day off. And so needing to document that you're teaching more than you are, but also having to take on too much teaching responsibility that you don't have time for, right? And so Matt in purple is sharing, oh yeah, I've been there. That's not sustainable. It's not good. And I'm responding in blue, this life is bad. What life do you have when you work on the evenings and on the weekends? You know, tell me more about this unless you don't want to talk about this, right? So we were talking about how at different parts of our jobs or different parts of our careers or different contexts that we worked in, what was physically stressful about it? Teaching early in the morning, teaching late at night, not having a lot of time. So really sharing our struggles and frustrations about this, right? So yeah. So in organizing our findings and presenting them, we organized our findings around 3 ways. The first was on the emotion labor that we experienced as teachers, right? So our experiences as teachers, we had values, we did things, and we had institutional obligations. The emotions that you see here on the right-hand side, the emotions that we experienced were frustration and irritation and excitement, right? But we felt that we had to sort of hide some of those emotions or definitely show some of those emotions because of the feeling rules, right? The institutional expectations that we faced about how emotions are shown or hidden. We felt the need to hide our frustration, to display our enthusiasm, and to commiserate. And so we were thinking about our roles working with collaborating teachers, our roles as teacher educators, right? And so if you think about this idea of emotion labor and emotional capital, right, we were talking about times when we helped our teachers with their emotional experiences. So this is me, I'm C, this is Carlo. I'm sharing an example of when I worked with 2 teachers who were feeling distressed about their class, right? So 2 recent teachers that I worked with, they were freaking out after teaching a class. Their lesson was interrupted by an alarm in their building. They were teaching a class and there was an alarm that we were on Zoom and then an alarm went off and they felt like, oh no, we messed up. They felt guilty and discouraged because they got distressed and they showed that distress in front of their students. And they thought, oh, I showed my students how unprofessional I was by panicking. That's a failure. And I was telling them like, no, like feeling distress is part of the process of teaching, and you don't have to hide that, and you shouldn't ignore that. And I was reflecting on that, and it was kind of like I was thinking how their program helps them think about their thoughts as teachers and their decision making as teachers, but it doesn't really push them to think about their feelings and what their emotions tell them about their teaching. So I was talking about how in my practice as a mentor to them, as a teacher educator, I encourage them to pay attention to their emotions to try to understand the different situations that they worked in. Right? Matt was talking about a teacher that he worked with, right? So he was working with a teacher who was tutoring a student, and the teacher was trying to use a communicative approach to tutoring, right? But the teacher was afraid to try that because the test prep approach that she was expected to do, right? Because that's what the students' parents who paid her wanted her to do. She felt like she needed to do that. And Matt was talking about how he helped the teacher feel better about like breaking with her values. She knew that it was wrong, but she had to do it anyway. And Matt was like, well, if we focus on why you think it's wrong and what your values are, just acknowledging those values of what you wish you could have done is a good thing, right? Philip was talking about working with a group of pre-service teachers in a class. They were in a teacher education class, and there was a little bit of tension over a group assignment, an assignment that they were having difficulties with, right? And so the teacher was upset, and Philip was saying that as the teacher educator, he played different roles, right? So he was the cheerleader. He wanted the student to succeed. He was a conflict mediator. the students were disagreeing with each other. He had to be a fair, neutral judge because he was grading the students, and he wanted to be a boundary enforcer and tell the students, you have to finish the assignment. And said he was talking about how he thinks the issue is resolved. He felt like he guided the student through the tough interaction, but he realized that it was his course assignment and his assessment practices as the teacher educator that created the conflict, right? And so to give you a last example of this, I was talking about how two teachers that I worked with were complaining about their coworkers. They were complaining that their coworkers were incompetent or not professional, and they wanted to complain to me about them, about their coworkers. And so I kind of let them do that. I encouraged them to do that. I complained with them about their coworkers. I was just trying to support them. And I felt guilty about that because I didn't want to like make them feel bad about being critical, but I also didn't want them to be critical of their peers. And so in lots of different ways, we all experience lots of emotional things. And so in the top part of the figure, you see the focus is on the teachers that we worked with. So in the top part of the figure are collaborating teachers, their values, their practices, their obligations. They felt tension from misalignment when they couldn't do what they were expected to do. And so the emotions that our collaborating teachers felt were things like distress, guilt, frustration, and irritation, right? That's illustrated over here, right? There was emotion labor that they had to experience, like hiding their distress and frustration or avoiding their confrontation. But in talking with our collaborating teachers, we tried to do things like show their alignment between their practices and their values. So think about Matt telling his collaborating teacher, it's okay if you want to do the thing you can't do. It shows your value of communicative language teaching, right? Or this one, explicitly validating and acknowledging the teacher's emotions that we worked with. It's okay that you feel this way. It makes sense that you feel this way because this. So we're trying to highlight how the practices of the teachers that we worked with still aligned with their values, right? Or that their practices were strategically negotiating the institutional obligations that they faced. So the green here, the green dotted lines and arrows kind of reflect what we tried to do to our teachers as teacher educators. So by acknowledging and validating their emotions, by showing their strategic negotiation, by telling them about their alignment that we see, we're trying to sort of support them with these things. So we tried to create what I'm illustrating here with the red rectangle is the emotionally hospitable space where teachers' emotions are allowed to be experienced, right? So the red circle on the right here is full because teachers are allowed to experience their emotions. It's a warm place. They can feel their emotions, whether it's good emotions or bad emotions, whatever. However, in the process of doing that, we experienced emotion labor as teacher educators, and that's the bottom triangle here, because the institutional contexts that we worked in are the same as our collaborating teachers, right? And so especially for Philip and I, who worked at the same university as some of the collaborating teachers that we worked with. So we're thinking about how in trying to support our collaborating teachers in developing emotional capital, this process creates emotion labor for us because we also have expectations that the universities, the institutions that we work at expect of us. And so we felt guilt and frustration, but we felt the need to hide this guilt and frustration to our collaborating teachers and instead be supportive mentors, be supportive teacher educators, try to mediate conflicts and try to commiserate. And so we felt the need to perform certain emotions or hide certain emotions in working with our collaborating teachers. And so what we're looking at here is how teacher educators trying to help collaborating teachers with emotional capital, that might create emotion labor for teacher educators as well. So we're looking at how the relationship between the teacher educator and the language teacher can create emotion labor for both parties, right? So then later we are also reflecting on how our experience collaborating with each other to reflect on this process, did this process create emotional capital for us? So just to show you an example, I was talking about needing to evaluate my collaborating teachers, my mentees, by giving them feedback, like good and bad. Your teaching is good or bad, right? And how this feedback gives them a grade on their course. And I felt uncomfortable with that because I know that those grades created emotional stress to the teachers that I worked with. And so I did not like that. but I was afraid to show the teachers that I worked with, I was afraid to show them my frustration about this assessment tool because I didn't want to speak badly about the institution that we were all at, that they were learning at this institution, I was working at this institution. I also didn't want to complain to the institution because I didn't want to lose my job. And so I talked about not saying anything about, like, hiding my frustration and not saying anything about it, but then finally wanting to say something about it. And in responding to that, Matt was talking about reframing this experience as thinking about how I'm a savvy strategic player in this game that the institution created. And he talked about how what I was doing was really navigating the system and trying to help the teachers survive in this assessment context that might not always recognize their pedagogical decision making. And so he was giving me positive feedback on my mentoring practice. And so what we illustrated here in this final figure is how, for us as teacher educators and teacher researchers, we conducted this collaborative autoethnography, this collaborative reflection process. And for us, even though we experienced tension and emotion resulting from those tensions, like guilt, frustration, discomfort, and exhaustion, and even though we felt emotion labor from the expectations of the institutions we worked at, we felt the need to support our colleagues, to mediate their conflicts, to commiserate and complain with them, to hide our guilt and frustration. By interacting with each other, we did the same things that we did for our collaborating teachers. So we, collaborating together, acknowledged and validated each other's emotions. We highlighted the alignment between our practices and our values, and we showed how the practices and the obligations that we did showed strategic negotiation of these contexts. And so what we're showing here is how, for teacher educators collaborating together through the process of self-study or collaborative autoethnography, that process can be a space of developing emotional capital, right? Creating a space where we're allowed to feel the things that we feel, whether they're good feelings or bad feelings, right? And so what does this all mean, right? What does this all mean for research on language teacher educator emotions, right? And so we think that these insights add to what we know about language teacher emotions as a field. And so this study is among other studies that highlight the role of the teacher educator in supporting language teacher emotional capital, right? So if the goal is to understand language teacher emotion labor and promote language teacher emotional capital, we think the teacher educator plays an important role there, right? We also think that this study tells us more about emotional capital and emotion labor. It might be easy to think that emotion labor turns into emotional capital, right? That it's one way. But our study looked at and showed us how emotional capital can also turn into more emotion labor. So it's complex, it goes both ways, it's not linear. And then lastly, we think this raises awareness of the process of collaborative autoethnography or collaborative self-study as a possible source of reflexivity and emotional capital among language teacher educators, right? So what does this mean for practice? What does this mean for our work as people who work in language education spaces, maybe as teachers, maybe as teacher educators, maybe as supervisors, mentors, in a lot of different roles? So Sarah Benesch and Matt Pryor talk about the importance of interrogating institutional working conditions, right? So not just thinking about how can we help teachers feel better, but how can we change policies? How can we increase or decrease workloads to help teachers feel a sense of satisfaction and well-being? How can we maybe change the expectations that we place upon teachers and teacher educators so that they have a sustainable workload on their plate and aren't overworked, right? We also thought about how the different teachers and teacher educators in our study, because they work in different contexts and are at different career stages, this idea of emotional support not always being there. So the precarity, the unpredictability of emotional support. And so we thought whether it's a pre-service teacher or an early career teacher or a later career teacher, regardless of the career stage or context, any educator probably definitely needs a space for collaborative reflection and emotional capital, because these issues are relevant to teachers at all stages of their career. And so how can we build in spaces for teachers to collaborate together or reflect together to try to understand each other's emotional experiences, right? And then specifically thinking about pre-service language teacher education is a topic that I've been really interested in. And so thinking about how can we incorporate emotional reflection, that's a typo, it should say reflection, into language teacher education, right? So instead of just preparing teachers who can think, how can we prepare teachers who can pay attention to how they feel, right? And so I wrote a paper about this, and I drew on Joe Gakonga's tripartite model of mentoring. And so Gakanga talks about how good mentors tend to provide one of these different things, either technical support, here's what you should do, or emotional support, it's okay, or reflective support, helping teachers think about problem solving for themselves. But it's really hard to do all three of these things because they're in tension with each other sometimes. And so based on this model, I make some suggestions for how, as teacher educators or mentors working with teachers, we can model our thinking, but we can also model our feeling. And we can encourage teachers to reflect on how they feel after a class as windows into understanding their pedagogical values, their beliefs, and their decision making. And so this is one kind of direction we think the implications should go. Another direction is to just highlight the work of our colleague Bedrettin Yazan at the University of Texas at San Antonio. Bedrettin Yazan has used autoethnography in teacher education spaces and has developed a sort of a pedagogical tool called critical autoethnographic narrative. And it's a self-study, it's a reflective assignment for pre-service teachers to reflect on their past experiences and their decision making as developing teachers with a focus on their emotions and identity, right? And so this idea of using self-study, using autoethnography in our teacher education practices as a way to develop teachers' reflexivity as they reinterpret their past experience in light of their developing identities as teachers, right? So that's another thing we wanted to highlight. And then finally, I just wanted to show you, if you're interested in reading the paper that this project is based off of, we recently published it in the International Review of Applied Linguistics in Language Teaching. It's called Emotionally Inhospitable Spaces, Reflecting on Language Teacher Educator Collaboration as a Source of Emotion Labor and Emotional Capital. And then I'm happy to share these slides later. I included a couple references about emotions and applied linguistics here that I talked about earlier. And then a couple references about autoethnography and narrative inquiry that I showed. And then here's a couple references that relate to the work that my colleagues and I have been doing about teacher-educator emotions and emotional experiences. So thank you again for letting me come present this project. These are my other two colleagues, and they were a part of the team too, and I just wanted to give them some recognition. And that's where I'm going to pause, and maybe we can transition to discussion now.
Thank you, Carlo. It's very insightful and awesome. And we still have 77 participants at the beginning. Initially, we have only 50, but it's double. So it means that this presentation is more interesting. Yeah. So okay, now we can move to another session, question and answer.
Sure.
Please.
And again, I just wanted to put this slide back up to highlight, like, happy to talk about any of these things, either the
Okay.
topics or the
Okay, Maisa, please.
implications, anything.
Please, Maisa. Okay,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Hello, good morning, Carlos.
Hi, good morning.
Sorry, I cannot open my video. Is it okay?
That's totally fine. No worries at all.
Well, Carlo, it's really insightful presentation. I did my my current research on this actually. It was my dissertation or my PhD project. And then, but it used, I come from, and I started my research from the self-empowerment dimensions, Carlo. Then I find it that, yeah, I'm with you now, that sometimes the teachers need to be like emotional coach for our students, or for even ourselves. The teachers should be able to be emotional coach, just like coach. So we need to teach even us how to be the real coach of manage our emotion. And what just have you said to me seems very aligned with my value. You said about the value, right? So that's why, wow, seems that I find another partner to do the more and the next research with you, Carlo. Okay, so then my current, then actually I'm now here in the pace of that we need to reform our mindset of being a teacher, of being a language teachers. Have you ever read about what is it, the pyramid of emotional consciousness from Hawking? I am also doing that kind of more reading about it, Hawkins consciousness pyramids. So when
Consciousness?
consciousness pyramid,
Uh-huh.
Hawkins, he used to be the professor in Cambridge University of Physics. You just check it out. And then he talked and he described more about how to be how to have a good and high vibrations, how to take us be in the high vibrations, because we will, when we come in the high vibrations, it is a kind of enlightenment. So we could be the real coach of ourselves, of our life. When we are being the real coach of our emotional and put us as the higher vibrations, condition and feeling that must be very related in the emotional. So that's why actually we could be the real coach of ourselves. And of course, the high vibrations will be also transferred automatically with the persons or our students, with our colleague and etc. So when we have that in that kind of vibration, so that's actually the real of what the English or the language teacher should be, Carlo.
Mhm.
Do you agree with me then?
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting way to think about how the teacher has a possibility, but also a responsibility to be the coach for the students, but also the coach for themselves. And I think it
Exactly.
shows us that, like, students are humans, teachers are not robots, teachers are also humans, and teachers also
Exactly.
experience things, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
So yeah, no, I think that's important. And how the teacher's doing is going to affect how the students are doing. Sometimes when I talk about a project like this, some of my colleagues will say, well, the teacher doesn't matter. I'm just interested in the student because the student is the one learning. And it's like, well, if the teacher's having a bad day, that's going to affect the students too, right? So yeah,
Exactly.
that's important to always talk about how everybody
Yeah.
in space is a human and everybody's going to affect everybody. Yeah.
Okay. But I think we will have the biggest challenge, Carlo. What is the biggest challenge? Because now, I am in the kind of interested doing, we are now facing the AI, what is it called? Thunder. I said thunder is like thunder, right? AI is a kind of, sometimes it could be a threat, and it could be a threat, yeah, for us as a teacher, as the language teachers especially. But we need to realize soon that actually not AI will replace us, right? AI will never be able to replace a language teachers. But we need to hurry to find a formula how to change and transform our mindset that the English teacher is not only teaching how to speak English or language, but the language teachers is someone who could who could be emotional coach for themselves to lead the student to come to the enlightenment process, so they are able to be very creative persons and lead their own life to be a good human, to be a well-being persons. Because without the language, without our language competence, sometimes we lost. We are trapped in the AI. We are trapped in the technology enhancement. We are trapped even in our emotional problem, just like that you have an instance, right, Carlo? So we need to find a very sophisticated formula for our language teachers' future. How to, what is it? Just a simple thing, for example, I'm having in the kind of hypothesis that we are a language teacher must teach us, our students or ourselves, to be more critical thinker. Because that's the point. AI will not help you anything when you do not have any things in your mind. You need to question to yourself all the time. You also need to develop your critical literacy or critical digital literacy. That's the point. So I'm doing that, Carlo. I'm doing the research about critical digital literacy now. And I'm very open to have and to find more partners to do that, especially with you and with your partners there in Massachusetts. Or perhaps with Mr. Henry Wanton juga. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Carlo. It's very good presentation.
Thank you very much for sharing those ideas and sharing those comments. I think, yeah, no, I think it makes me think of three things, and I'll be brief. But one, I was just at the AAAL conference, the American Association for Applied Linguistics, and one of the frameworks that I'm really interested in is investment, right, related to identity, right? So Ron Darvin and Bonnie Norton's investment framework with identity, ideology, and capital. And there was a colloquium, and a couple of the presentations were talking about like critical digital literacies and students' investment in generative AI tools, and how that engagement with generative AI tools was an emotional experience for students and teachers, and kind of thinking about how the engagement with the tools will affect us and make us feel lots of different ways. And so the importance of developing, like you said, critical digital literacies. The second thing it makes me think of is somebody wrote a paper and shared it with me recently. It's called Navigating the Emotional Landscape of Artificial Intelligence in Language Education, Digital Literacy and Teacher Experiences. And I think the purpose, I haven't read the paper yet, but I think the whole point is how engaging with AI is an emotional experience as language teachers, maybe because some teachers feel empowered, and maybe because some teachers feel threatened, like they're going to lose their jobs. And I think that gets to sort of the third thing that you were saying, what the coming thunder, right, of AI, what do we do about it? And Hendry and I have a friend of ours, Matt, one of the collaborators in the presentation, and he always says that when people ask him all the time, are you worried that AI is going to take your job as a language teacher? And he says, I'm not worried that AI is going to take my job. I'm worried that you think AI is going to take my job, because that makes me wonder what you think I do as a language teacher and what the role of language education is. And I think, based on AI or based on a lot of other topics, a lot of my research looks at why students want to continue studying languages in the United States, especially when they don't feel the need to study a language. And the reason I'm interested in that is because in the United States and other Anglophone contexts, universities are destroying language programs because they think, oh, we don't need another language. English is fine. We're just going to, fire all these people and get rid of language education. And we're like, no, that's so bad. That's no, we can't do that. We have to save and preserve language education of all kinds. And so, one of the things we've been trying to do is do research with students to understand what they think they're learning in language class besides just language. So if you take a French class, are you just learning French, or are you learning more than just French? And a lot of times students do think they're learning more than language. A lot of times teachers do think they're teaching more than just language. But it's risky if the other colleagues on campus don't think that, if the administration doesn't think that, if the administration thinks that all we do as language teachers is teach grammar rules and vocabulary, we're not doing our job in terms of showing them what else we do. Because if they want students to develop things like critical digital literacies or like other 21st century skills of just being in the world with other people and kind of developing intercultural competence and things like that, if we are doing those things, we need to document that we're doing those things. We need to show that we're doing those things so that students see that they're learning more than language, so that teachers can think that they're doing more than that, because that is, I think, more than what we're doing. And that so our other colleagues who are not language educators, but other colleagues on campus or our supervisors, our administrators, can see that what we do as language educators is more than just teaching language. And so, yeah, no, I think that that is really important, because a lot of people think that AI and Duolingo and other apps are just going to replace language teachers. And AI can do a lot, but an AI it's not artificial and it's not intelligent, right? It's something completely different, but it's not a human, and it's not an emotional living being. And so there is something special and unique about humans interacting with humans. And I think that will be an interesting thing to think about how that continues to be a topic of investigation, a topic of discussion. Yeah.
Exactly. Interaction, right? That's the new point, the interaction between human and technology. I think that's also could be one of the further research. Yeah, Carlo.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Bu Maisa, for the question, and Carlo for a good answer and very insightful. And go to the next question, please.
Yes, Pak Henry,
Oh yeah.
this is very interesting topics. Carlo, this is what is it? I just try to confirm to my students because I just exit from my classroom and I taught one of them, hey, come here, and I'll ask her. Just now I listened to a presentation. This is very interesting to know the misalignment about the emotion between I as the teacher and them as the students, and know what is this? Her reply. Sir, this is because we are in the classroom is on high alert that we are afraid of making mistakes.
Yeah.
So I think this is what is it? When I ask for the questions, so Najwa, what you hope that we can reach? Sir, it needs for us, we need more motivations that you can build our confidence. And please, how, this is your problem, but how to solve this problem? What do you think about this? This is real from my student. Just now, I invite one of them to come to this room. And we are here in one room in Zoom. She is now in this room too. Thank you. What's your what is it opinion about this one? Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing the question. I think the microphone cut out a little bit, so I didn't hear the whole part of the question. I'm wondering if you could maybe, I heard you were talking about misalignment between the teacher and the student, and then if you could repeat the question, I would really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, Pak Misdi, talking about one student. Oh, I don't know.
Ini tidak
I'm not
bergerak,
sure.
Mas Hendri. Kenapa videonya tidak bergerak ya?
Oh yeah. I'm not sure. Just need your clarification. That is what I got. Your question is about you found one student who are struggling with learning in English or something like what?
I just confirmed whether the tension, emotion tensions in the classroom happening in my classroom. I just call them up here. One of them is Najwa. She is here in my room. I asked her, do we experience emotion tension, misalignment, different hope, different emotion in the classroom? And she said, yes, Pa. Yes, sir. Your expectation is too high, and we are getting afraid to say something in the classroom, to speak up in the classroom, so that we are not free in the classroom. This is a confirmation, and I want to listen to Carlos' experience from his findings responding to this situation. This is also a critical incident from my classroom.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you for the clarification. That's really helpful. Yeah. So I didn't present. So I'm thinking about the answer to your question, like just a different project, right? So this project was about teachers and teachers' emotions in different spaces in relation to, in maybe interacting with their students. But I'm thinking about another project where I was looking at students' emotional experiences in classroom spaces, specifically related to things like being afraid to talk in class or not wanting to talk in class, and where that feeling comes from, right? So I think it relates to the idea of like psychological safety in the classroom, or like just feeling comfortable or not comfortable with things like using language. So this context is in the United States. It's a university context in the United States, and the students that I was working with were students who first language English, second language Spanish. They might be considered second language students of Spanish, but also working with students who might be considered heritage language students of Spanish, right? Students who have maybe family members who speak Spanish, maybe they spoke Spanish growing up. So lots of different types of multilingualism, basically. And these students are interacting in the same space. And some of this data was observational data, me being in the classroom. Some of it was audio recording the student interaction in the classroom. And then some of it was talking to students afterwards through written reflections or oral interviews. And what I learned was that a lot of the students, whether they were heritage language students or second language students, a lot of students felt a significant discomfort, a lot of anxiety and fear about speaking Spanish in the classroom or just speaking at all in the classroom based on how they think other people were going to evaluate their language. So either the second language, the L2 student, was afraid to speak Spanish because their partner was a heritage language student who has more experience, right? So the second language student is afraid to speak Spanish because her language is not as strong as the peer, or afraid to speak Spanish based on the feedback that she gets from the instructor, who either says really critical feedback like that's wrong, or gives feedback in a way that is still interpreted as like drawing attention to her like lower language level. And then at the same time, the heritage language student, even though she has prior experience with Spanish, she kind of feels like because her language is not standard or perfect Spanish, she feels afraid to use it because she doesn't want people to see her using what she thinks is incorrect Spanish. And so in all of these ways, the idea of or the feeling of being uncomfortable using the language in class was connected to somebody's idea of whether their own language was like successful or not, or effective or not, or like legitimate or not, but also the idea of somebody else's idea. Like, how is my peer going to perceive my language use? How is my instructor going to perceive my language use? And so I think what's interesting about that project is to look at how this idea of expertise, like what counts as successful or effective language, is socially constructed. It's random. It's not like a one, clear-cut thing, but it's all this perception that's developed based on what people think other people think. But it still makes people feel a certain way in the classroom. So it makes people feel nervous and uncomfortable in the classroom. And so because these different students and their instructor have these different expectations or ideas about what type of Spanish is correct or incorrect or legitimate or not legitimate, it leads different people to feel uncomfortable in different ways. So yeah, that's definitely, maybe we didn't look at that in this project that I presented because the focus was more on the teachers and how the teachers feel. But in another project that I'm working on, it's actually my dissertation study. The students that I worked with definitely talked about a lot of different emotional experiences specifically related to being afraid to use language in the classroom for those reasons. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
Thank you, Pak Misty, for question and Carlo. I have another discussion with my friend using another platform, but I want to ask you some question. Okay, let me to read the question. Yeah. Okay. So in doing and conducting collaborative autoethnography, how to reduce bias, because we know that we cannot avoid the bias, but how we can minimize the bias, because the source of the data is coming from the author itself.
Yeah.
So it is very subjectivity, we know that, but how make it the rigorous methodologically, and how make it, if another qualitative study, we can use reliability, something like the triangulation, different methods such as interview, uh, observation, something like that. But how can we used in collaborative autoethnography? Okay.
Yeah. No, that's a great question, right? How do we avoid bias in autoethnography? We can't, right? We can't avoid it. It is bias, right? It is the most subjective of subjective points to research. That is the whole point, right? But I think with qualitative research, the goal might not be to avoid bias, but the goal might be to, like you said, develop trustworthiness and be transparent with our methodological practices. And so I'm thinking about, I want to just grab something really quick. I work with a lot of colleagues and peers, Hendra, you do too, here at Michigan State University, who
Yeah.
I'm thinking specifically about some of our professors who are like, qualitative research, I don't understand, right? So there's a book I have on my desk, and it's called, I'm happy to share the link. It's called Qualitative Literacy, a
Mm-hmm.
guide to evaluating ethnographic and interview research. And the
Mm-hmm.
whole purpose of the book, the whole premise of the book is, quantitative research is intended to do this thing. It's intended to generalize statistically to larger populations of people. And so therefore, we have to evaluate quantitative research on its design and its goals. Qualitative research has a different shape and a different purpose. And so qualitative research cannot be evaluated in the same way. It has to be evaluated differently because the goals are different and the structure is different. And so what they talk about in this book is like, sample size is not going to make it more or less credible as research. Instead, it's what you can show with the data, right? What you can show with the data. And so the different types of things that the authors talk about is cognitive empathy, so understanding your participants' perspectives. Well, autoethnography, it's pretty easy. I mean, we are the participants, right? Heterogeneity, so complexity, right? So showing complexity and depth of experience. And then palpability is like specific, detailed, concrete examples. And so with autoethnography, I think you said something like triangulation, right? So I think in a way, because the goal of qualitative research is this idea of depth of exposure, whether it's individual autoethnography or collaborative autoethnography, I think the goal would be to show that you're not just saying, I have this idea about myself and that's it. No, you have to prove it and substantiate it with like multiple examples that show that it's something concrete and not just an idea that you have. And so,
Mm-hmm.
in a way, we can't totally avoid bias in autoethnography, but I think there are ways of leaning into and justifying the choice to be subjective. Because in a way, narrative inquiry and autoethnography in particular, the whole point is subjective interpretation. That is the point. It is supposed to be a subjective interpretation. And if it's not subjective interpretation, that's not what it is, right? And
Mm-hmm.
we can't really get away from that. I can talk all day about that topic, but I saw that there were a couple more questions that were just entered into the chat, and
Yes.
do you think maybe we should look at them too?
Okay, yeah, sebenarnya. But there's I got it inspiration from you that giving the example to prove what we the idea it's I think is more clear to me. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So when writing collaborative orthography, I need to provide example. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we can start from Nina. Nina Cassandra have question. Oh, do you want to read or I need to read?
Are you asking me?
Yeah. Do you want to
Oh,
read?
yeah, sure, yeah. So Nina says, hi, Carlo. Thanks for sharing this relatively new topic for me in our context. I'm currently doing a collaborative self-study on our dialogic practice, and I feel like this narrative autoethnography has some similarities with what we're doing. Great, that's awesome. Yes, I would agree. I'm looking into emotional geography in my study, but it's got me thinking it could be a great topic for our future research. What do you think? I'm not familiar with emotional geography, but I think the idea of geography suggests this idea of mapping different emotions where they come from. So I think that's a really important thing to think about, the different ecological contexts that we work within. So that sounds really promising. Collaborative self-study, I think autoethnography is a type of self-study, and I think that self-study, especially as educators, is a really important thing that we should do for our own reflective practice, but definitely a helpful thing we can do as a teacher practitioner research tool. So yeah, I wish you good luck with your project. It sounds really interesting. I would be really interested to read or learn more about emotional geography. And if you think that this project was helpful for you, like that's great. And we wrote the paper about it and it is open access. But if you have any trouble finding it, please email me. I would happy to share it or be more in touch if you want to, talk more about this. later on, that would be fine too. But yeah, that sounds interesting, and I wish you good luck with your project.
Hi, can I ask one question?
Okay, sure, Salawati.
Yes, I'm currently doing a training for some teachers. And then so what I got from them is that they improve their it's a TOEFL training. So the leadership management asked them to do a TOEFL test. So I trained them TOEFL with the all section grammar, reading, and listening. So during the session, it's full of complaint from teacher because the leadership management asked them to achieve certain score of TOEFL test, and the result of my training is that it seems that it's blocked them for improvement. The older teacher, about 50 years old, they say that I cannot comprehend this anymore. Either this man is going to fire me, I'm okay with it. So it seems that the situation become really overwhelming for them. And so I'm asking your opinion. I don't know whether you ever did any research about is there any different reaction between people or teacher with certain age, 50 years old above or lower than that. So I'm thinking to do this after attending this presentation. I'm thinking to go further and investigate what happened, what's going on with them, and then is there any difference between the age reaction of emotion? Are they being deeply suppressed with the requirement from the institution or not? So let me know. I want to know what you're thinking about it, and how can I go further if you can suggest me a little bit about to go further with it. Thank you, Carla.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing the experience, and what an interesting experience it sounds like, right? It is very striking to hear what the teacher said about, like, I feel like I can do this, I can't do this, and it's blocking me from improvement, right? And if I can't do this, I might lose my job, but I might be okay with that, right? And so, and in a lot of projects that my colleagues and I have worked on related to this, what we look at is sort of the different responses that teachers have to these dilemmas, and how some teachers might, give in to the pressure or just give up, right? Some teachers might say, well, I'm just going to, sacrifice my values and teach the way I'm expected to do it so I can keep my job. And other teachers would say, it's not worth it, so I'm just going to do something else. I'm going to quit. And so there's a variety of different reactions and responses. And that probably depends on specific contexts too. But it is also interesting to think about, like, how different teachers at different stages of the career experience that. And so just before this meeting, I was having a different meeting with some collaborators. We're writing a paper about 3 different teachers. 2 of them are really early career teachers, and one is like a very later career teacher, and sort of how they experience different emotional challenges and things like that. And we were talking about this book written by some colleagues in Austria called Language Teacher Well-Being Across the Career Span. And so I'm happy to share a link too, but the reason I'm showing it is just to show how one of the focal parts about their big project working with teachers in the UK and Austria was looking at teachers who were pre-service teachers, early career, mid-career, and late career, to see what were sort of the similarities and differences with how they experienced well-being, but also challenges to well-being. And I think, that it would be really important to think about how teachers at different stages of their career maybe have similar needs, maybe have different needs, but maybe all experience some kind of challenge. And so how can we best support them? And so, yeah, I don't have an easy answer, but I do think it is a worthwhile. I think there's a risk in research on language teacher education to assume that once teachers are out of teacher education, they're fine, they're good. And that is just like so not true, because all of us at all of our career stages have challenging experiences, even as teacher educators. And so it's important to not forget that and think about how we can support all of our colleagues at all career stages. And so, that sounds, my heart goes out to you, because that sounds like a really challenging situation to work with the teachers who are facing that, what sounds like a really top-down, unrealistic top-down policy expectation, right? Where they're like, well, you know, this isn't going to work, but it's going to affect me and my job. And so, yeah, no, I think it's definitely worth, you know, understanding more. And so, yeah, I don't know if that's something that you plan to explore, you know, in collaboration with these teachers, perhaps, or maybe if they're not going to be sort of co-researchers, if you just, you know, plan to explore, think about your own practice working with them. But I think it is interesting and raises questions about teachers who are earlier in their career, teachers who are later in their career, you know, how much of a support network do they have? Do they have colleagues? Do they not have colleagues? Do they work in a large department? Do they not? And what are the spaces that they have to reflect with each other? And then I guess the last thing it makes me think of is you said, oh, it blocked them from improvement, from developing. And I'm thinking about there was a special issue of Applied Linguistics Review, and the topic was about creativity, I think, in language education. And there was a paper by Constant Leung and Simon Coffey where they looked at teachers' experiences with agency and creativity, and how being able to be creative and make decisions about curriculum made teachers feel agentive, but teachers who felt like their agency was constrained by, you know, curriculum or policy or other requirements and obligations kind of stifled their ability to feel like a legitimate teacher. And that caused some teachers to say, I don't want to be a teacher anymore, and quit the profession. And I think that's a big issue. I mean, in the United States, definitely, but I think around the world, you know, there's like big problems of teacher shortages, especially in language teaching contexts. And so if we want people to be language teachers, we need to support them being language teachers. And that means, you know, not putting these unrealistic top-down expectations on them, but helping them cultivate a sense of agency, cultivate a sense of identity, and create a space where they're able to feel emotions and be okay with that. And so, yeah, I wish you good luck with the work. It sounds really challenging, but it sounds really important.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you. I saw Nina had written the question, and we talked a little bit about that. And then we have, I do agree with language students' use is often not at native level standards with incorrect pronunciation and grammar. These issues make them feel insecure and hesitant to speak up. Right. And the messages that we send to students about what the expectation is will make them feel certain ways. And so if we tell students that the goal is to sound like an imaginary perfect language user, and that's not realistic or ever possible, then they're going to maybe feel that way. And so I think it raises a question, what the implication of my dissertation project for the language program, that's the context of this project, is I'm going to tell them, you need to have your classes communicate to students that the goal is not to be something that they're not, because you need to set a realistic goal that they're going to feel like they can accomplish. And so, yeah, no, I think that's very important. I'm looking at the chat again. I had the same issue during my dissertation proposal when I mentioned that autoethnography leans more on subjectivity, and the research panel outright rejected my autoethnography dissertation proposal because they said it's biased. Oh no, I'm so sorry. It made me feel so bad because they were basically unaware of this type of method. Maybe I should write about it as a research paper. Yes. Oh, please. I encourage you to write about that as a research paper. I would love to read it, and I would love to assign it to my students who learn about quantitative and qualitative research. There are so many different ways of doing research, and all of those ways of doing research have different structures and formats and different purposes, right? And I think they should be evaluated differently. And the dissertation committee, they're not evil people. I think they just don't know, right? They just don't know, you know? And I think that's why this idea of qualitative, I mean, that's what the qualitative literacy, the goal is to help people learn about qualitative research, be literate in qualitative research. So yeah, no, I empathize with that. And I hope this qualitative literacy, this book, is helpful for you. But yeah, no, I think that's a really challenging thing that a lot of my peers experience, having their work be evaluated by other people in a way that is like, they're not familiar with it, so they don't know how to evaluate it. And that's frustrating because as graduate students, we are in a precarious position where we have to finish our research in order to graduate. And if we have somebody who's kind of saying, no, you can't do this because I don't understand it, that's not really fair. And that's probably not the best person to be the evaluator. But I know sometimes that's just the reality of what it is. And so, Yeah, that I feel like if you wrote a paper about that, or if you shared that experience, I think other graduate students would really appreciate learning about that, because it would probably make them feel like they're not the only person experiencing that. And so I think that's something that we should all do more as graduate students, is share our not just share our success stories, but also share the sort of frustration stories about when things don't go according to plan, because everybody thinks like, oh, you're doing a dissertation, that's so great. It's like, well, yeah, well, when I was proposing it and my committee member told me it was a bad idea, that made me feel bad. And I'm not going to write about that in my dissertation, but that's something that I experienced. It sounds like it's something that you experienced too. So I think I would encourage you, yeah, to maybe, maybe later on when it's safe, if you feel comfortable doing it. I mean, we don't want to publicly like write about anybody in a way that makes them look bad, or maybe you do, I don't know. But yeah, no, it would be important to maybe in a way that you're comfortable with, to share that story with other graduate students in a way that could help them. So yeah. Um, and then Brad and I couldn't agree more, Carlo. I faced the same issue every time I did my qualitative work. Doing qualitative study included autoethnography cannot be separated from subjective interpretation. Hence, we cannot avoid bias. Exactly. Just try to explore the strong justification of our interpretation. That's exactly right. I remember there was another graduate student early in my program who was asking me, how do you avoid bias in interpreting and reporting on your findings? And I was just like, I don't avoid it. You have to lean into it. We have to acknowledge it. And that's what qualitative research is. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. And then I'm seeing the last one here. Hello, Mr. Snaglia. I am still a college student, but I have questions that I've been thinking about often, the questions that appear through my observations. Nowadays, people are getting more and more aware of emotional and mental well-being, but there are those who refuse to acknowledge that it's okay to feel emotional and frustrated as a teacher. Yes, even saying that it's unprofessional. Exactly. That's an example of feeling rules. Exactly. Emotions are unprofessional. The idea that emotions are unprofessional, both from fellow teachers, their colleagues, and parents of some of the students. Yes. I've heard some of similar stories, not only from others, but also from my parents, since they are teachers. How do we deal and face those problems and criticisms? How do we regulate our emotions if we, college students, soon to be teachers, one day face similar situations firsthand? Oh, yes, that question encapsulates so much of what this project was about. Yeah. This idea of feeling rules, the expectations about what emotions are permissible and allowed and what emotions are sort of sanctioned or prohibited, those expectations might be like explicit rules that say teachers need to be professional and positive to students, or they might be implicit expectations communicated by colleagues or by parents of students, all 100%, definitely, right? And so those ideas shape how we feel as teachers. And the long-term overall goal is to change everybody's expectations and to change the working conditions so that we don't have to be exhausted by being overworked, and so that we're allowed to feel vulnerable and emotional. But that's not going to change overnight. And there might be some colleagues who will never agree with that and always think that, emotions are weak, or emotions are not professional. And, we might not be able to change their mind. But maybe if we're working as a teacher, I'm thinking, if you're working as a new teacher, it would be a good idea to try to find other teachers that you can communicate with, who you can share your emotions with. So maybe it's your classmates in your teacher education program. Maybe it's other teachers at the place you work at. And maybe if you don't have a large department at the place you work, maybe it's your colleagues who you can connect with in spaces like this on Zoom, right? But trying to find places where you support each other and really reflect and say, hey, how was your class today? Oh, I had a really bad class today. Like, I had a really stressful day today, and let me tell you why. And a place where you can like comfortably talk about your emotions. Maybe it's not with the colleagues who think it's unprofessional. Maybe it's with your other peers who maybe they're not even teachers, but they're just your peers, right? And then I think as teacher educators, as teacher educators, we have a responsibility to help new teachers think about the way they feel, and I'm thinking about the example of the mentee teachers, the pre-service teachers that I worked with, who said to me like, oh, I got really distressed when the building that I was in, when the alarm went off. And I said, why are you distressed? That's out of your control. You can't control that. You have to do the class on Zoom, and you're in the room that you have access to where you can do the class. If the alarm goes off, that's not your fault. And they're like, oh, but then my students are going to think it's unprofessional. And I'm like, then don't be professional. You know, you're a new teacher. You're allowed to be vulnerable, and they know that, and that's okay. Nobody expects you to be perfect. You know, why do you think you felt frustrated, or why do you think you felt distressed? And so we had conversations about like, oh, well, I want to present myself this way to students. And it's like, okay, well, what's the ideal way that you see yourself being presented to students? And we used that conversation to think about their identity now and their identity in the future, about sort of who they see themselves as now, who they are, and who they want to be as a teacher. And so we used this sort of how do you feel right now to reflect about who do you want to be sort of in the future as you develop as a teacher. And based on that experience, it just got me thinking about how if teachers are encouraged to reflect a lot about their thinking and make decisions, right? How are you making decisions between your beliefs and practices as a teacher? Your teacher education programs are always asking students to justify their decisions based on their beliefs and practices, right? Theory, practice, connection. So they're able to think about their thoughts, but if they're not thinking about their feelings, that's, I guess, a missed opportunity, because the way we feel tells us about what we're experiencing and where we're working. And so leaning into the emotions, making space for the emotions. And so I think as teacher educators, we have a responsibility to support new teachers in that way. And so those are some ideas that I have about how you might be able to support yourself and your colleagues, your peers, in this early stage or later stage of your career. So that's a really short answer to a really, really long question, but I hope that's really helpful and gives you a little bit of encouragement. Thanks again for sharing that.
Okay, Carlo, maybe it's about the time. Yeah, there are so many things that we need to ask and have question, but we have limited time. In Indonesia, it's already at noon there. Okay, so, and Carlo, do you mind if you share your PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, I'd be happy
And
to.
also the link that book you show, because some of my friend, hey, could you ask Carlo what the title of the book is? Very nice, qualitative research, and uh, something like color or ethnography. I don't know. I don't remember. Okay, okay. And also we have Pak Din today here, and Pak Din want to say something to close our agenda. Okay.
Pada ambil menu tadi luar.
Uh, Pak Dekan, or do you or okay. Pak Dekan, halo. Iya, Pak. Masih di mute, Pak. Oh
Oke,
iya.
siap. Udah
So,
selesai, Pak Henry? Are you finished?
Carlo, do you want to say something in conclusion, or because
just-
after this we have closing ceremony from our dean. Just
yeah,
a closing remark.
I just wanted to say thank you again for the invitation to be here. You know, I said this in the first presentation, you know, as graduate students, we do this work and we're encouraged to publish it or present it at a conference.